right. So thank you very much, Sonia, for that kind introduction. Since I happen to be the first male speaker of the day, I should probably start by going on record that I do clean the toilet. And what I would like to present to you for the next 30 minutes or so is the research in the lab that has been going on for the past couple of years, trying to investigate or differentiate the effects of sex and gender on the mostly the stress response and the brain morphology differences that you can observe when you do structural imaging, and then also a little bit looking into functional neuroimaging differences that we observe. I have to apologize maybe just a tad for the very, very broad title that you find in the program. But when Sonia's organizers harassed me to finally come up with a title, I wasn't really quite ready yet, so I said, okay, I have to use something which is very, very general, so I thought this would fit the bill no matter what I would end up presenting. All right, so what is the research about that we do in the lab? In general, it has to do with the effects of stress on health, acute and chronically. And this is, of course, something that is a theme not only in my lab, but that goes on in many different laboratories around the world. And I think we all recognize the importance of stress in health and disease. It's directly and indirectly associated with a number of diseases. And here, just to name a few, we could say there's hypertension, there's coronary heart disease, there's depression, which are believed to be at least indirectly associated with the effects of stress. And of course, there are direct stress effects that lead to disease like burnout, chronic fatigue, and fibromyalgia. And according to a study by the WHO, the stress will be the second leading cause of disease over the next 10 years. So certainly something that is worth looking into. Now, interestingly, there is a known disparity, and this was already alluded to earlier in the day, between men and women in stress-related disease, and there are also many examples that one could give. I just gave two here for the lifetime prevalence of depression, which is much higher in women than it is in men, and a trend for an opposite effect can be observed for hypertension. Now, what's interesting is that many of these adverse health effects of stress can be linked to the metabolic effects of stress. And this, of course, then is a direct lead to the fact that men and women are systematically different in the way that they respond to stress. And then one of the questions that we have been trying to tackle at a little bit over the past couple of years is whether these differences are either sex or gender effects. And there's reason to assume that they could be either. If you take a recent study, or diagram rather, by Herman, who has done some pivotal work in animal research trying to illustrate the higher order centers of stress regulation in the brain, so the higher order centers of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in the brain, which is what I will mostly be talking about, you will see that there are brain stem nuclei that are important in affecting on the HPA axis, but there are also higher order centers like the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the medial amygdala that converge in regulating the stress response. So you can make the case that it could be something that has to do with a more biological effect on regulation of stress, but on the other hand, because of the higher order limbic centers, also something that might have more to do with the way that we perceive the environment, which could then lead or be related to socialization and more gender effects. So let's start by reviewing the literature and the studies that have kind of led to our current work as far as the sex effects are concerned. And then this is a study by Kudielka from 2005, who studied the differences in the cortisol stress response to a well-known psychosocial laboratory stress paradigm in humans, the triosocial stress test, where basically a person has to give a public speech in front of an audience for 5 or 10 minutes, which is usually followed by a short period of mental arithmetic for another 5 minutes, and this leads to very robust cortisol stress responses. But if you split this overall robust stress response between men and women, and then you further look into the subgroups of women that naturally exist by means of whether the women are, as far as the menstrual cycle is concerned, in the luteal or the follicular phase, and whether the women use oral contraceptives or not, you can see that this will further differentiate your whole group to induce different responses. So for the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is the second one in the cascade of hormones released by this major stress axis in humans, you see that there's mostly a difference between men and the rest of the women. So the rest of the women are not really different here. But when you go on to look into plasma cord, which is now the final result of the activity of this axis, CRH, ACTH, and then cortisol released from the adrenal cortex, you see that the women start to further differentiate and start to look more apart. And then finally, if you look at the saliva-free cortisol levels, then you can tell that now, looking at the same differentiation between women in the luteal or follicular phase and the oral contraceptive users, they are now clearly apart. So these are most likely sex effects. And if you then look at the way the gonadal hormones are changing over the period of the menstrual cycle, you can then start to draw conclusions about whether these sex differences are related to the changing levels in either estradiol or progesterone over the course of the menstrual cycle. So this would let people to believe, and I think this is the current stand in the literature, that as far as sex effects are concerned, you can find that the hormonal changes that are associated with the menstrual cycle seem to significantly affect the cortisol stress response, which you would then conclude is a sex effect. What I personally find very interesting and would like to further investigate in the studies that we are going to do in the lab is the other side of the coin, if you like, and these are the gender effects. And there a number of studies have also contributed to our understanding how gender might influence the hormonal responses to stress. And a first study that came out by my former PhD supervisor, Clemens Kirschbaum, in 1995, looked at the interaction of the stress response with the presence or absence of social support. And the basic idea is very similar to what I just talked to you about. There is the mental arithmetic and the speech in front of the audience, but in this study and in this case, it happened either in the presence or in the absence of the partner. So if the partner condition was true, then your partner was basically in the room. Then there was a condition where a stranger was in the room, and this stranger was also instructed to be supportive and to provide an emotional support atmosphere to the subject performing the stress task. Or you had the no partner or stranger support condition, which is the typical TSST, where you would be alone speaking in front of the audience. And then what you see here is basically the area under the curve of the cortisol response, so the total amount of cortisol released, and split for men and women. The women are not further divided for their menstrual cycle, but it was controlled for to make sure that this doesn't have an influence. And what you see is the typical picture that you saw just before, where the men usually show the strongest response to the TSST when this task is being performed, with the women showing a lower response. In the stranger situation or condition, this was pretty much the same, although the men didn't respond quite as highly anymore. But what was, of course, the most interesting is that if the partner was present, the cortisol response to stress in the men now went significantly down, basically to the level of the women in the other conditions, and the cortisol response in the women went significantly up, basically to the level of the man in the no support condition. So in other words, if your partner is with you and you are a man, that's a good thing. If your partner is with you and you're a woman, you don't want to be stressed, because it actually doubles or triples your stress response. This was followed by an interesting story by Stroud Salivoy and Apple in Biological Psychiatry in 2002, where they tried to, based on these differences, see whether they can further differentiate the stress responses between men and women depending on the type of stress task. So they were thinking about, okay, maybe it has something to do with the type of stressor that is being used. And what they compared in their studies was the responses to an achievement stressors with a response to a social rejection stressor. And the achievement stressor is pretty much the mental arithmetic task portion of the TSST that I just talked to you about. But subjects were specifically instructed to try and achieve as best as possible the score, to do the math as quickly as possible, and that this would usually be not a problem for the average user to perform. So it was really trying to trigger the achievement component of the task. And then, as you can see over the course of this experiment, it was the males that significantly reacted to this type of task, whereas the women with very little standard deviation really basically do not show any response to this type of task. However, this was then contrasted in another group from the same group of authors and the same publication with a social rejection stressor, which is gone into the literature as the YIPS, the Yale Interpersonal Stress Task, where the women were instructed that this was a task where we would be simply getting to know each other, and you would sit with in a group of 3 and you would start to talk to each other for a period of 15 minutes, briefly interrupted by a little pause, and then for another period of 15 minutes. But 2 of the 3 participants in this task were actually confederates to the experimenter, so they were previously instructed to act increasingly rejecting and exclusive to that person that is being investigated, to create the type of social rejection that the authors here wanted to investigate. And as you can see, in response to this social rejection type of interaction, there is a significant response this time, but this time it's only in the women. So it's not there in the man. However, and we'll come back to that, do note that there is a very large standard deviation this time, so that it doesn't seem to be a uniform response that is taking place. My take on this error here, on this deviation here, is that you had basically women that responded to the task very strongly, and you mix them with women that did not respond. So overall, you get a mean response, but you get this very large standard deviation.